Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum session on future of migrant workers in international supply chains, post-pandemic outlook on migration, human rights, and business. My name is Mia Park. I'm the Chief of Mission at IOM, International Organization for Migration in Vietnam. Personally, I was very happy when I was asked to be the moderator for this session, as I've been quite interested and wanted to learn more about this topic. And we're very lucky today as we have renowned experts on our panel. So we have panelists from the government, NGO, international agencies, and research groups. So we will be able to hear from diverse actors with different perspectives. But before I introduce them, just a brief introduction background on this topic. So there are about 170 million migrant workers globally, of which about 40% are women. And we know that migrant workers play a very important and positive role for not only their home sending countries with their remittances, but also their destination countries as they fill the key gaps in their labor market. And for those who work on migration, especially labor migration, since the pandemic began, we've talked and learned a lot about the impact of COVID-19 on migrants. And there seems to be two key aspects that have been highlighted with the pandemic. First is that migrant workers are quite essential. So although we've always talked about how migrant workers make great contributions to the global economy, but the pandemic made us witness and experience their very important presence as they sustain the global supply chain and essential sectors such as agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, services, and even healthcare. But this visibility and the recognition that they're so essential also brought to light how extremely vulnerable they are. And not only about the migrant workers' vulnerability and how they're so easily neglected and dismissed by relevant actors, including governments and employers and businesses, which we will discuss today, but also how fragile this human mobility is. This international connections we took for granted turns out to be very easily disrupted. So we've seen and continue to experience these major disruptions in migration flows and consequently in the international supply chain and global economies. And this is all happening at the same time as the world, and especially Asia Pacific region, we face multiple ongoing non-COVID related challenges and megatrends, such as climate change, aging societies, and digital transformations. And they all have direct impact on migration as well. So today, what we want to explore is how will these impact of COVID-19 and these changes we are seeing all mean for the future of labor migration in the Asia Pacific region. So to discuss, we want to ask our panelists, I guess, three main questions. Which factors will influence the regional labor migration flows and dynamics in the next decades? And based on what we know about the current vulnerabilities, how will the future drivers of labor migration impact vulnerabilities of migrant workers? And lastly, what can the government and businesses do to better equip migrant workers for these changes, especially in the context of inclusive and just COVID-19 recovery and beyond? And these are tough and difficult questions to answer. You know, if we learned one thing about COVID is that the future, even tomorrow, is very hard to predict. But we are in good hands today as we have excellent panelists with us. And it really is my honor to introduce our four panelists. So first we have attorney CELSO Hernandez. He's currently the director of the Labor Market Development Branch of the Philippines Overseas Employment Administration. His experience in the overseas employment program started in 2008 as legal officer. And then after he handled several divisions and offices in the POEA and was exposed to industry regulation, education, and welfare assistance. He contributed in the creation of several manuals, handbooks, and guidelines strengthening worker protection and handling illegal recruitment and trafficking in person cases in the Philippines. So welcome, Director Hernandez. And then we have Mr. NILIM BARUAH. He's been working on the migration issue since 1998 and earlier in the development field. So before assuming his current responsibility as Senior Migration Specialist at the ILO Regional Office in Bangkok in 2011, he was the Chief Technical Officer of ILO's Technical Cooperation Labor Migration Projects in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. And earlier, he headed IOM's Labor Migration Unit in Geneva from 2002 to 2007. And we have our lady panelist. We have MINAKSHI BARMAN. She is a senior manager with the Economist Intelligence Unit's public policy consulting practice in the Asia Pacific region. She works with clients, supporting them through public policy engagement programs, policy strategy design, thought leadership, and developing insights on macroeconomics, geopolitical, and regulatory issues. She's an experienced economist, obviously, and has worked on projects ranging from infrastructure finance, city growth strategies, urban disaster management, to labor migration. And last but not least, we have Mr. William GOIS, who's the current regional coordinator of Migrant Forum Asia, MFA. Over the last 20 years, he has been at the forefront of international advocacy efforts, engaging and influencing international and multilateral process to promote rights-based migration and development policies. He's the former chairman of the Global Coalition for Migration. He's also a member of the World Bank-led Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development, and a member of steering committee of the Metropolis Asia and the Asia Democracy Network. He's also regional executive committee of the Asia Pacific Movement on Debt and Development, and he represents MFA in the Abu Dhabi Dialogue, steering committee on the Comprehensive Information Orientation, and thematic working groups on the Colombo process. And he also represents MFA in the IOM's IRIS Advisory Committee. So we have an excellent panelist group today, and thank you all for accepting our invitation today. So before we invite the speakers, I'm still not done. I have some general instructions to give. We will have the Q&A session at the end, and there is a Q&A, I guess, function box on your screen. So please freely use it, and you can pose your question anytime. You don't need to wait till the end. It's actually better if you ask the questions in advance. And there will be a simultaneous interpretation. So if the speakers can speak slowly and not too fast, that would be great. So let's begin our first part of the session, focusing on the future labor migration dynamics. For this part, we will invite NILIM from ILO and MINAKSHI from EIU to give us a glimpse to the future. So NILIM, will go to you first. The future of work and impact of COVID-19 on labor migration have been important focus of ILO's work. And in fact, earlier this year, ILO, in collaboration with OECD and ADB Institute, came out with a very comprehensive report. And I believe you were one of the lead authors. So we want to ask you today if you could share about how the future of labor migration and future work for migrant workers expected to look like in the medium and longer term. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mia. Good afternoon to my fellow panel members. Greetings and good day to everybody. As Mia just pointed out in her introductory remarks, the pandemic has had unprecedented impact on economies, businesses, and workers in our region. and the usual drivers of migration have been disrupted. In 2020, especially in April and the months following, deployment more or less came to a standstill. And even now, we don't have much deployment of lower skilled workers, although there are exceptions. There's some deployment now. And the deployment of skilled workers has been going on in the pandemic because it is easier for, the mechanisms are such that the migration costs are more easily met for the skilled workers. Now, what is going to happen in the next few years, in the medium term and in a longer term horizon of 15 years? As Mia was saying, it's difficult to predict. But three main factors which will help shape labor migration in the next few years will be the recovery, economic recovery, the recovery of labor demand, and going side by side, the control of the pandemic, the vaccine rollout and public health measures, as well as shifts in migration policies, which may impact the opportunities for labor migration. In the long term, demographic and technological changes, new forms of work, and climate will be key factors shaping labor migration. Let's look at the medium term and labor shortages. As you know, migrant workers comprise a large proportion of the workforce. Migrant workers from Asia comprise a large proportion of the workforce in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, in Singapore, in sectors of the economy in Malaysia and Thailand, to name a few countries. This demand is unlikely to change in the short term, and labor migration is expected to recover with the control of the pandemic and vaccine rollout. Hence, vaccine rollout is very important, and as we can see in our region, it is not going very well at the moment. There has been a fall in economic output, as we know, in 2020. The rebound in growth in 2021 is uneven and not universally expected to recover the losses of 2020. As an example, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is an important destination for Asian migrants, is forecast to see a fall of 6.8% growth in 2020 and growth of only 3.2% in 2021. Beyond the recovery horizon and assuming the pandemic is brought under control, some trends suggest risks. Outflows from selected Asian countries, 12 selected Asian countries, peaked in 2015 at 5.6 million workers. After 2 years of decline in 2017 and 18, outflows reached 4.9 million workers in 2019. The main reason for the decline is the fall in labor flows from South Asia to GCC countries. This is partly explained by the price of oil, which supports much of the economic activity in the region and has been languishing and is expected to remain low for some time. Shifts in migration policies will also impact on labor migration. We have seen that with the introduction of a new scheme for specified skilled workers in Japan, the country is targeting 345,000 new labor migrants in different industrial sectors by 2020. This provides a new opportunity for labor migration. At the same time, there can be restrictions as well. And these restrictions occur not only in destination countries, but in sending countries as well. Indonesia has seen a decrease in outflows from a high of 630,000 workers in 2009 to 277,000 workers in 2019. If you look at the outflows in Indonesia, there was a big drop from 2016 to 2015. And the reason for this is the immigration bans which were instituted for domestic workers to the Middle Eastern countries. And as a result of that, the labor migration flows have fallen. There'll be more attention to health in the migration process. And the new screening systems will impact on costs. And this is a policy area to give attention to so that the costs are not passed to the workers. In the long term, demographic and technological changes are an important driver. The expanding population of young persons in some countries is set to increase migratory pressures. This includes the South Asian countries, Indonesia, Philippines in the Southeast Asia, as well as Pacific Island countries. At the same time, aging populations in other countries will place additional strain on social security and health systems. Countries with a rapidly aging population include China, Japan, the Republic of Korea, Singapore, and Thailand. In all these countries, the dependency ratio will be well over 50 by 2035. The risk of shortage is especially acute in occupations where labor demand is likely to increase because of aging itself, such as care work and healthcare. At the same time, labor markets can be impacted more broadly due to aging, and migration can be one strategy combined with other measures to address shortages and fiscal imbalances. Technological advances, AI, automation, robotics will render some jobs obsolete and create new ones. A ILO study in 2016 found that in the automotive and auto parts sector in Indonesia and Thailand, 60% of salaried workers in Indonesia and 73% in Thailand faced a high risk of automation. Of course, some jobs will be easier to replace than others. They are easier to automate assembly line jobs and harder to automate jobs in care work. The speed at which jobs are eliminated in migrant receiving countries depend on several factors, including how fast technical challenges are overcome and how fast labor costs rise. The availability of migrant workers may hold down labor costs and slow efforts to automate. The next factor, in addition to demographic changes and technological developments, is migration transition and new poles of attraction. As we know, many years ago, the Republic of Korea and Thailand were labor sending countries. Today, they are mainly labor receiving countries. Other countries will also undergo this migration transition by 2035, most notably China. China is actively pursuing a transformation from export-oriented, low-skill, labor-intensive economy to a science, technology, and innovation-based economy, a transition that demands highly skilled workers. And they have already put in place programs to attract skilled workers to China. The last point which I want to mention, last but not least, of course, is climate change. One of the developments expected to drive migration in Asia Pacific are anticipated climate-related changes. Changing climate can affect agricultural output and the frequency of natural disasters, as well as the habitability of certain zones. Looking beyond 2035 in the Pacific Island countries, where the average elevation of urban atolls is less than 4 meters, and where a significant share of the population reside in low elevation coastal zones, sea level rise along with other sudden and slow onset hazards are likely to severely impact livelihoods across the Pacific. So that, in short, are some of the factors which will shape labor migration, both in the medium term and longer term. Thank you, Mia, and back to you.
Thank you, NILIM. Thank you so much for that very thorough and detailed, but still quite comprehensive outlook. and also giving us the medium and longer term effects, certainly helpful for the policymakers and practitioners to prepare them more strategically. It was very interesting when you talked about automation that lower the labor costs, it will slow down the speed of automation because that's all related to low-skilled migrant workers. That's a little sad point. And also climate change. It's a very important area which will have a significant impact on labor migration, but has not been explored in depth too much. So thanks for bringing that up. So now let's turn to Meenakshi. Now that NILIM has given us kind of broader picture, major trends, maybe you can specifically speak for lower wage international migration in Asia region specifically. I know there is an ongoing research on this topic with IOM. Although the report is not finalized yet, would be great if you can share some initial findings with us. So I guess our question would be, based on your ongoing research, what are the key factors in destination and origin countries that would affect future lower skilled labor migration pattern? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mia. Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening as well. Thank you, NILIM, for your thoughts and your insights. I believe we will find ourselves aligning on a lot of issues as I take you through some of my research findings. So, as Mia mentioned, we at the Economist Intelligence Unit, supported by the IOM, conducted a study on the future of labor migration in Asia, which began earlier this year. Based on this study, I will be sharing a few findings from our research about the drivers of labor migration in this region. And for purposes of this study, we focused on low-wage international labor migration. So we began by looking at how low-wage international migration has evolved in Asia over the last 2 decades. And this was done mainly to identify the drivers behind these changes and analyze how risks and challenges faced by these migrants have also evolved over time. So as we know, labor migration in Asia is a product of history as well as evolving cultural and economic changes, while traditionally factors such as linguistic and cultural affinity, diaspora networks, and geographic proximity have hugely impacted migration decisions. More recently, we are observing factors such as diverging economic growth rates between countries, the facilitating power of digital technology, as well as impacts of climate change driving these decisions more increasingly. So the biggest structural change in Asia that we noted was intra-Asian migration, which means that increasingly there's a huge increase in the number of people who are migrating from less developed economies to some of these newly emerging markets within the region. As part of the study, we looked at net migration rate and international migrant stock data published by UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And based on data from 2020 or for 2020, we basically were trying to identify the top origin countries globally. And we noted that of the top 10 migrant origin countries in the world, 6 are Asian, which are India, China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Philippines, and Afghanistan. We also noted that based on our estimates, not only Asian states feature in some of the Asian origin countries, but they are also they also account for low-wage immigrants in particular. Speaking to some of the labor migration specialists, we found that of roughly 164 million migrant workers globally, 50 million hail from South Asia alone, namely India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Afghanistan, and more than half of these constitute less skilled or low-wage migrants. I will move on to talk about a bit of the drivers behind these changes in migration movements. The first driver, and I will highlight 6 key drivers. The first driver that I want to talk about is the economic dynamism of Asia that has accelerated this intra-regional migration that I just spoke about. So the economic outperformance of Asia, especially South and Southeast Asian economies, including Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, indicate a likely growth in this intra-regional migration in the years ahead as well. And given that Asia is forecasted to account for more than 50% of global GDP and drive 40% of global consumption by 2040, we expect this trend to further accelerate in the coming years. Secondly, for a lot of high and middle income countries in the region, the driver behind rising migration has been native worker shortages in critical sectors such as construction, food processing, health and elderly care, with Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand being the dominant magnets here. Traditionally, low-wage workers have favored some of the high-income Gulf countries, but we see a shift here, and this could be primarily because of falling oil prices, which have dampened spending, as well as the fact that in some of these countries, the worker protection policies are still at nascent levels. So that is one of the key drivers. The third that I would like to mention is demographic shifts in the region. As NILIM also pointed out, so there has been an increase in aging population in the region. One of the key drivers in inbound migration is going to be demographic shifts. So it has been estimated that by 2015, there will be almost 2.5 times increase of the number of people who are age 65 and over, especially in some of the East Asian countries. And for that, they will need to import at least 275 million people aged 15 to 64 to keep a balance between their working population. Another factor to note here is that there has been an increase in educational attainment in some of the developed or high-income countries in the region, which often results in native workers not gravitating a lot towards high physical labor work as compared to professional or white-collar jobs. The fourth driver that I would like to talk about is large-scale infrastructure and economic transformation plans. For a lot of countries like Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, infrastructure has been at the heart of their economic strategy. So while infrastructure can prove to be a boon, can prove to be an employment boon in the region, it is also to be noted that the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic may cause disruptions in the sense that it may curtail some government spending and cause a deprioritization. Therefore, for instance, in countries like India, its ambitious infrastructure plans may face severe adjustments given the scale of the ongoing pandemic there. Finally, or at number 5, I'll talk about technology and automation. So technology is already altering labor market, is already reshaping labor markets, and is estimated to have complex impacts on migration decisions. Now, automation will reduce labor demand in some sectors, which are more process-oriented, like manufacturing and services, but some sectors, or especially the low-wage sectors, will not get as impacted, like construction and domestic care, among others. Also, a thing to note is that advances in digital platforms, gig economy, on-the-go services will create more opportunities for domestic income opportunities in home markets, and therefore there will be a reduction in the appeal of migration, especially in some of the more physically demanding sectors like construction. Finally, the last driver that I'll mention here is the falling cost of remittances. We've noticed a fall in the cost of remittances, which has helped outward migration. There have been several factors that have contributed towards this, but one of the key factors is a rise in consumer supporting information sites. These sites provide information for fees comparison as well as exchange rate comparisons across countries. They also provide educational information as well as other financial services such as savings, payments, services, and insurances. They also provide local support in host countries. To sum up, these are some of the drivers that have emerged from our study on the ongoing research with the IOM that we believe are going to shape future low-wage migration in the region. Thank you. Over to you, Mia.
Hello?
Hi, Mia.
Okay, I
did
think
you hear?
it broke up a little. I assume, yes, Meenakshi, are you done?
Yes, I'm not sure how far along did you get me. Should I repeat the last points?
Yes, I assume it's done because we broke up a little bit. But I heard, no, I heard till the fifth. So I think yes.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting points. And it's good that I read the draft of the report. So I am familiar with the points that you've raised. And certainly there are concerning aspects that can seriously impact labor migration in the region, but also opportunities we can possibly seize. And we're definitely looking forward to the final report. And so based on NILIM's and MINAKSHI, I mean, future of labor migration seems to depend on sectors and channels and, of course, economies and policy changes. But the broader trends such as demographic transition and the new technologies with the fourth industrial revolution and climate change are real and will have consequences. And certain changes would be more clear and definite than others, but we know for sure that due to these factors and which were all affected by COVID-19 and probably expedited by the pandemic, that future of migration will be impacted. But in the more of an immediate and medium term, the key would be the COVID-19 recovery and the consequent economic recovery. So we will need to look into that. So now, that we've gained some insight on the potential future of driver migration, let's turn to the second question that we want to explore, which is the vulnerabilities of migrant workers, how they will impact the migration and employment experience of migrant workers in the region. We want to specifically look into the human rights and labor rights, protection of migrant workers, and also the development impact of labor migration. And for this question, we're extremely lucky to have our expert panelists from Migrant Forum Asia and the Philippines Overseas Employment Administration. So let me first ask William. MFA and your member across the region are at the forefront of assisting migrant workers in the region. And so you're really in a unique position to bring in direct perspective and experience of migrant workers in the communities of not only origin, but transit and destination. So William, question to you. Based on what's been shared and your long experience working on labor migration issues, where do you see the future risks and challenges for migrant workers, including from different gender groups? Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Mia, and thanks to NILIM and Meenakshi as well for the introduction in terms of giving a big kind of global picture of where things are going to move. I'd just like to add to that first, before I go to the granular aspect of it from the ground up, is that I think one of the things that labor mobility will happen within is the growing inequalities that the pandemic has brought out or shown that exist in our world today. And this has only been exacerbated by the tremendous amount of borrowing that has been taking place by countries and countries of origin in order to address the COVID pandemic. So countries like the Philippines, Bangladesh, Nepal have the borrowings that they have taken in the international market are definitely going to add to the increased inequalities because at some stage you've got to pay this back. So I think some of the old frames that we look at are very useful to look at now in this, looking forward, in the sense of and these are questions I think we will have to deal with. Will there be an increase in aspiration of migrant workers, given that the recovery is not going to happen so fast, particularly in countries of origin? Will there be an increase in aspiration among migrants, particularly low-wage migrants who have found their whole development trajectory disrupted by losing jobs and being away from jobs for months? Will there be an increase in aspiration? Will there be an increase in desperation, in the sense of leading to more irregular flows? Is that going to, if you look at Euronews today, even today on today's channel, Euronews is already showing the increased level of desperation of migrant workers as they cross borders, kind of thing. Will there be an increase in offsetting the challenge in countries of origin in terms of job employments? Because like Mia said, a lot of the original infrastructure projects which somewhere low skilled workers would fit into, like construction, those will have to be offset. She gave the example of India. So will then India offset some of this low labor surplus that will now be created in the countries of origin because of the COVID? Will it offset it like in previous years to labor migration programs? I think that is going to be the big question of, will aspiration, desperation, offsetting increase in this kind of frame that we are looking at? Now let me start from ground up and let me give you two cases which shows how we are at a very delicate moment now, in the sense of the progress that we have made. We are at the point where we might see a lot of regression of some of the gains that we have made. I give you two examples of this. Only this week means in the last 7 days, only this week in the Philippines at Naiya Airport, the international airport of the Philippines, there were almost 500 OFWs, overseas Filipino workers, mainly women, who were stranded at the airport. They had already checked in. Philippine Airlines had already checked them in. The airlines had already checked them in, but they were stopped at immigration. Why were they stopped at immigration? Because for immigration did not get the clearance from the country of destination. They were all bound for Saudi Arabia. They did not get the clearance from Saudi Arabia that Saudi Arabia would be responsible for the quarantine and for the PCR test of these 500 workers who were scheduled to arrive in Saudi Arabia. There was no guarantee from the Saudi government that this would be handled by the employers. The immigration officers stopped the 500 workers who were to be deployed, and they were asked to return. Some of these workers, many of them, had already paid for quarantine facilities in the Philippines because they had come from the province. So they had to stay in the hotels in Manila and things like that, take PCR test before the flight and things like that, 72 hours, to be able to board that flight to Saudi Arabia. But all those costs they had absorbed, and now the question is, who's going to absorb the cost at the other end? Saudi Arabia passed a regulation saying that recognizing only 4 of the vaccines. In many of the countries of origin, Sinopharm has been the vaccine that has been given to a majority of the population. Saudi Arabia refuses to recognize Sinopharm as one of the vaccines that which allows you entry into Saudi Arabia, which means then you have to take a quarantine, spend time in quarantine for 14 days before you can actually go onto the job. So there is this whole question of the recruitment thing. The recruitment governance. How is this going to happen? This is a big question to happen. Another example of this, we talk about the growth of the care industry. In this month only, just about 3-4 weeks ago, in India, 500 nurses from India, from the state of Kerala, landed up in the UAE for jobs that were not there. They were processed by recruitment agencies in India and in the UAE. How did that come about? That even in a time like this, where there are so many restrictions on travel, so many checks on travels, 500 nurses could, in a period of months, travel all the way from Kerala to the UAE for jobs that did not exist. Some of them paid huge amounts for these jobs. So we've got to be very vigilant as to how recruitment, how the pressures that are in countries of origin at the moment, and we've got to be aware of how these are going to impact migrant workers. The other issue that the other two panelists have talked about is of technology. Let me give you another example of looking at access to technology. Now there are many migrant workers who are stranded in the countries of origin, but who have been told by their companies on half wage, you can actually work from home. So I've been in touch with, for example, a worker from Kuwait who is working from home in Kerala, in India, but his salary has been reduced to half wage. Now, this is definitely an innovation in technology, but what does it mean in terms of workers' rights? He has been given that option, and he has no other option. So when we talk of wages and technology, how technology will be accessible and will create these platforms, what does it mean for workers in terms of rights and wages? Workers are not able to come for collective bargaining because a lot of them are on these platforms, their homes, in isolated spaces, workers for collective action. There's been a long-term advocacy of migrant workers, of the right to freedom of association and join organized trade unions. Now this, with the whole of technology, doesn't fit this, or at least there are no signs of technology facilitating this online collective organizing of workers in the so-called either gig economy or in platforms that are now existing whereby you can work at home. So I think this is going to be a big challenge as well. The other thing, big question is of skills. A lot of us are talking about skills, and but nobody's talking now about skills bias. I'm glad, Minakshi, they are looking at the study of low wage workers. I must say, in our own experience, low wage does not mean low skill, because at least historically, low wage workers have also been high skill workers, especially when you have teachers going as domestic workers, doctors going as nurses, technicians going as drivers. They go into the low wage sector, but they might be high skill. We have not resolved that problem yet. And yet there's going to be a big demand for the so-called high skill, a bias against the so-called low wage. And with technology, the low wage workers becoming invisible, without having the right to collective bargaining and things like that and all, you have a big risk of low wage workers becoming invisible, despite the fact that the COVID has shown us that they are essential workers. So you have Germany, for example, that chartered planes to bring in the essential workers. Australia created policies for bringing in workers in the farm, in the agricultural sector and things like that. But the emergence of the essential worker on the global stage has not translated so far into policies to protect the rights of the emergent worker, of the essential worker. And we have not seen a movement towards that yet, in terms of, we have seen ad hoc measures here and there, but we have not seen policy measures. So when we look at the care economy and we look at the growing need that will from domestic workers to nurses and people in the care sector, when you see that expansion of the care industry, how are we looking at policies that will give them their rights and protect their rights, kind of thing, in this new economy, and particularly of domestic workers? Till now, at the global level, no multilateral institution, no government has put itself out there in front saying that domestic workers have held up households for more than a year and a half in this pandemic at great risk to themselves. They have held up households. Is it not time to make that step now to ratify the convention of the ILO on domestic workers? We are in the 10th year since it was adopted, but no organization, no government has taken this step to say, recognize it for what it is. We know in social struggles, that you can only acknowledge a struggle when you recognize it by its name for what it is. And that's why, if we are not going to recognize domestic worker as work and start moving towards recognizing the standards that protect their rights, I think that's going to be a big challenge. Demography, you have pointed out, right? Demography is another big issue that we will have to look at. I was looking at the agreement between Japan and India And Japan has moved into, for the first time, recognizing that it is not a homogeneous society. For the first time, Japan has kind of opened up to other countries with this kind of special skills agreement kind of mobility. But when you look at the agreement between Japan and India, for example, it is nowhere a reflection of the bilateral agreement, the guidelines that the UN Network on Migration has come out with. So where do you talk about protection of rights of workers within that kind of a bilateral agreement? There is no, even the words access to justice is not there, kind of thing. Even the word governance of recruitment agencies is not there. It's all embedded in very ambiguous language. So I think that's going to be a very, very big problem. When you look at countries of origin, when you look at countries of origin, right now we are looking at the fact that 83% of the Filipino workers who have returned to the Philippines, it's been 3 months and they have still not been able to find jobs in the Philippines. Of course, because the pandemic has affected all. But when you think of that, when you think of they haven't found jobs, what alternatives are there? And so I think when we look at vulnerabilities and you start looking at climate as well as one of the drivers, I think we are not measuring up to the challenge in terms of protection for the vulnerabilities and the rights of migrants. We are not rising up to that. We are looking at technology and things like that. The big frame we are looking at in terms of that will drive migration, but we have still not begun to look at what it will mean for migrants themselves. So once again, migrants are the pawns in a bigger migration policy of states, as states draw up migration governance policies, but we don't see migrants being at the center of it. And I think that is what is so missing. We are not learning from this very key lesson of the pandemic, and that is essential workers. I think if we just take time to put essential workers, many of them which are migrant workers themselves, at the heart and at the center of designing a lot of these policies, I think the world will look very different 10 years from now. If we don't do that, 10 years from now, the world is going to be a world where even more inequalities prevail. So I think it's important that we start coming to the center of what is our quest, or what is by design, what do we want to do. Thank you.
Thank you, William.
By design, what do we want to do?
Thank you, William. Although I guess the migration dynamics and trends would change, but most of the fundamental vulnerabilities and the discriminatory practice will continue to have effect on migrant workers. I mean, you talked about how existing inequalities and vulnerabilities have been exacerbated, but as we know, the complicated migration and recruitment process makes migrant workers, especially low-wage migrant workers, quite vulnerable. And with this COVID, with all these restrictions and new requirements, which is going to get only more, and the process will get even more complicated, this is a real concern for IOM as well, because it will further increase migrant workers' vulnerabilities. And thanks for pointing out the skills bias and technology bias. We talk a lot about technology, but we don't talk enough about, from the migrant workers' perspective, how we need to do better to protect them and prepare them better. And we really hope that the world will look a bit better in 10 years, as you said. But let's turn to the government side. Director Hernandez. Migrant workers from the Philippines, the overseas Filipino workers, are present in destination countries globally, all around the world, and in many different sectors, including healthcare work and domestic work. And especially Filipino healthcare workers around the world are a true unsung heroes, and they make tremendous contributions to COVID-19 response globally. And I don't think they've gotten the recognition that they should. And many migrant workers from other countries, the overseas Filipino workers have shown remarkable resilience throughout the pandemic. But at the same time, we know that there have been challenges, and including the case that William just introduced. So with your more than a decade experience managing and being involved in various aspects of sending one of the largest migrant worker population in the world, what challenges but also opportunities do you see in future, taking into account the future drivers of migration that have been shared? Over to you.
Am I clear? Hello, good afternoon. Okay, yes. Somehow, indeed, Mr. William earlier gave the scenario that happened last Saturday. I think it's Saturday, last Friday when we suspended the deployment of workers for Saudi Arabia, primarily because it is on the issue of uh, it's on the issue of the expenses that will be shouldered. Who will shoulder the expenses for our workers bound to Saudi Arabia, considering that the Saudi Arabia imposed a lot of health protocols for incoming migrant workers. Those are the challenges that we are currently. That is one of the challenges that we are currently being encountered here in the Philippines. The continuous repatriation of workers and the continuous repatriation workers. If I'm not mistaken, last April, I think we already have, I think around more or less 700,000 workers returning to the Philippines. And those includes those who lost their jobs, those whose visa and working permits had already expired, and those who merely opted to be repatriated because of the danger of contracting the virus overseas. All of those were assisted by the government through the Overseas Workers and Welfare Administration. We do have the OWA fund, the so-called OWA fund, where it's a contribution, which made up a contribution of our OFW. But somehow in the past few months and in the past years, since the onset of the pandemic, we have seen the depletion of these funds, and there's a need for us to uh, replenish it to be able to support our lot of our workers, and that's one challenge for us. Uh, Mr. William, I would agree to Mr. William that there's a heavy borrowing on the part of the Philippines just to be able to support our overseas Filipino workers. Although we're seeing that in the next 10 years uh, there's still some need, there's still a demand. Of course, the next 10 years will be the next decade. It will be greatly influenced by the pace of the recovery from pandemic and as well as future skill demands in the countries in the region. Although last year we had a study on this, and we see that there's still a need for skilled and professionals in the healthcare, the transport and logistics, seafaring, and technology sectors. But still, it's a big challenge for us uh, to safeguard the welfare and the protection of our workers. Currently, for example, in the part of the field, and also there's a challenge for us to balance the needs of these opportunities versus the needs that we have here in the Philippines. Currently, the Philippines last year had put 19 position, usually in the usually healthcare workers. They were put in a roster of mission critical skills and were barred from leaving the country. We issued a governing board resolution on that, and then later on it was considered, and we allowed nurses, nursing assistants, nursing associates to go out, but we had imposed a certain quota, which is 5,000, deployment for which only for 5,000 deployment for the whole year. Currently, as per POEA data, we had already deployed around more than 3,000 new healthcare workers, and we are expecting that demand will be and that quota will be fully exhausted by the end of June or July. But that's one challenge for us, balancing the needs of the local health industry and the local health sector as to the opportunity employment opportunities for our overseas Filipino workers. We also see that, of course, the need currently, one big challenge for us is attending to the needs of our overseas Filipino on site. Until now, although there are a lot of workers that are left overseas, but still they are confronted with a lot of cases, a lot of complaints on wage, non-payment of wages, the non-payment of wages, the different abuses, exploitations, uh, still it's for our domestic workers, being overworked, being exploited, and the what you call this, the withholding of their documents. All of these things are challenges for us. We only have very few Philippine overseas labor officers that could attend to their needs, and somehow GCC is still a big market. It's a big destination. The GCC is still a destination countries for Filipino overseas, and as we all know, like what Mr. William earlier discussed, the protection for low-skilled workers as well as the domestic workers is still a big problem in the GCC. That's one of the challenges that we had besetting the overseas employment program in the Philippines. Somehow we are always pushing for bilateral and multilateral agreements. We're always pushing for the protection of the workers, but somehow it's always takes two to tango. We cannot just merely impose our regulation on the destination countries and the receiving countries without risking our relationship or with the destination country without compromising our migrant workers there. Those are the challenges that are being encountered by the Philippines right now. Of course, we are seeing that what could influence on the next few years will be the processes that already started even prior to the pandemic for the GCC is the nationalization of the workforce had already taken toll. There are several workers who lost their job because of nationalization. Of course, there's also the technological evolution and of course automation that is happening worldwide. And somehow currently the vaccine itself, the protection of our workers who will be deployed overseas is also a big challenge for us. Currently, overseas Filipino workers are classified as under A4 on the level of priority of the vaccination. But somehow, the start for the vaccination of under the A4 category would only start for this year. And with the implementation of a lot of health protocols for example, in the Middle East for the needs for the vaccine, uh, we are facing a big problem as to the deployment of our workers. And likewise, what Mr. William had earlier pointed out, there's a need, for example, in Saudi, they do not recognize the Sinopharm and Sinovac. That is the most commonly used vaccine for our citizens. So that is a problem right now. Actually, we are negotiating. We are seeking clarifications uh, from the embassy of Saudi Arabia to be clarified on this, because this will be a big issue for us. This will be a big challenge for us, because if we're going to if they would not be allowing workers with Sinovac vaccine, it will definitely affect the deployment of our workers. Somehow, those are the current challenges uh, being faced by by our overseas Filipino workers and by the government itself.
Thank you very much, Director Hernandez, and thank you very much for sharing the many challenges that you face as the sending country. Because not only you need to, especially under the COVID-19 situation, you need to think about the national priorities, but also the physical distance of having the migrant workers overseas. It's difficult to reach out to them. But I guess at the center is, as a sending country, there's a limit to the leverage that you could have with the destination countries, and you don't want to compromise the labor market with your with the policies. So definitely there is many challenges that we see. And thanks for also mentioning the vaccine, which NILIM also mentioned, and William. This is probably going to be the key issue in this year and in coming year. Not only the access, but as you discussed, the coordination and recognition of different vaccines, and that's going to be a key. So thank you very much, but let's now turn to kind of the last part of the session. Now that we've discussed the potential future labor migration trends and outlook, and how that would affect migrant workers, but also the current COVID-19, how it continues to affect migrant workers. Let's discuss a bit about what needs to be done to better and prepare migrant workers for these changes when we want to maximize the benefit but minimize the risk of lower skill labor migration. And for this, we want to hear from all panelists from your different perspective. So what strategy, collaboration, and tools that will be needed for immediate future as well as longer term future of labor migration, and ensure that labor migration can truly take place in a safe, orderly, and regular way, that the migrant workers' right would be protected and respected, and all actors involved, including businesses, could benefit from the positive force of migration. And let us start with Director Hernandez. Since you've discussed the challenges, maybe you could also propose a solution and some of the efforts that the government of Philippines is doing. Over to you, Director.
Yes, ma'am. Currently, what we've seen here is that since there are shifting the landscape of overseas employment. And most of those who are affected will be the migrant workers with low skilled, and the domestic, and then also the domestic worker. We could always
Director
take note.
Hernandez?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We could always take note that a large percentage of our overseas Filipino workers are in the domestic and low skilled category. We
Director
see the need
Hernandez?
for. Hello, ma'am. Hello. Hello.
Okay.
Yes, we see the
Yes, I
need
think you're
for
back on.
Yes, ma'am. We see the need for upskilling and the reskilling of more of our overseas Filipino workers. If uh, we need to I think we for us we need to prioritize the upgrading of the skills of our workers, or looking for other skills that would somehow uh, somehow address whatever changes in the landscape of overseas employment for the Philippines. Somehow it's a big challenge for us. Somehow also I would agree with Mr. William, what Mr. William had earlier said, that there's a need really to look into the skills. No, I think for the low skilled workers are at least not because of the skill set, but so the nature of the migration regimes that uh, uh, the nature of migration regimes. I think we need. I agree that there are a lot of overseas Filipino workers, for example, who are working as uh, household service workers, or graduate of nursing. There are teachers that should at least reconsider uh, changing, changing, uh, changing upscaling and reskilling. And also, there's a need for us really for the government, along with the destination countries, to really lobby for the protection of our workers, primarily our domestic workers and low skilled workers. Uh, we all know how big how big the welfare cases that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. We do not have that much uh, uh, we do not have that much personnel on site that could attend to them. So what is needed is for us to lobby for the protection on site that will be given by our destination country. Unfortunately, still it's always been a challenge for us. We should lobby for fair wages, for decent working and living condition, especially for our workers who are in the essential services that really will be at risk with the current pandemic. Somehow, on the part of the Philippines, there's a current legislation being tackled in the Senate as to the creation of the Department of Overseas Filipinos, and this will somehow uh, somehow put all the agencies dealing with the overseas employment, overseas Filipinos, into a single department. Somehow, we're expecting that somehow help it could help in addressing the challenges and addressing the difficulties that we're having on our overseas employment program. We are honestly we are proud of having so-called established the overseas employment program for the past few decades. Somehow, as with the circumstances, with the scenario right now, we even with more than 40 years of experience in overseas employment are not prepared with what happened in this pandemic. We had encountered a lot of problems before, the mass repatriation of workers in Kuwait, in Libya, in Syria, and Lebanon. But somehow this is different. This is different. So somehow there's really a need for us to rethink and to evaluate and to revise all of our programs and our policies regarding about the protection of our workers. I think there's really a need to have a revamp. Actually, to have a revamp. And somehow, I'm hopeful that with the creation of the Department of Overseas Filipinos, we could prioritize that in addressing our problems on overseas employment program. And somehow it will not just be limited to our overseas Filipino workers, but also to all overseas Filipinos overseas. This will be a bigger, it will have a wider scope. Somehow, that's how we look at it. We really need to bargain. We really need to lobby with the destination countries. Like what Mr. William earlier said, the the suspension of the deployment for Saudi last Friday, but somehow it may be a drastic move on the part of the Philippines, maybe a very drastic move on the part of the Philippines. Somehow, we cannot allow a rampant violation of the rights of our workers. As the reports that we had received is that these workers will be paying around 3,000 Saudi riyals or more than that, and that will be advanced by their employees, but on the agreement that this will be on the salary deduction basis. It will be again deducted from the workers. Somehow, we need on the part of the Philippines, it may be drastic, but somehow this drastic moves. We are compelled to do this drastic move just to be able to protect our workers. And somehow, in just one day, we had an assurance on the part of the Saudi government that they would notify and they would impose this policy, that a regulation that the expenses on the COVID screening and the quarantine should be shouldered by their employers and should not be shouldered by the workers. Somehow, we need to do those drastic things just to be able to protect our workers. And somehow, I hope that this could serve also as a signal to other GCC countries, particularly GCC countries, as to these issues and concerns on the part of the overseas Filipino workers.
Thank you, Director Hernandez. And I can't agree with you more on not only the sending country's role in protecting the rights of migrant workers, but that no country was prepared for this COVID-19 pandemic. And with the 40 years experience of the Filipino government, and if your government is now not ready, I don't think there would be many government that could appropriately and timely respond to this huge pandemic. And also on-site support at the destination country, that's going to continue to be important, and we look forward to hearing more about that model, and so the other countries can also learn from it. So let's quickly move to Minakshi and William and NILIM. Maybe keep 2-3 minutes for each. Minakshi, maybe you are engaged in research in this area, so what would be your recommendation to build back better? Over to you.
Thanks, Mia. I'll quickly highlight a few of our takeaways from the research here. So at the very start, I'd like to just reinstate that through our research, one of our key findings was that the issue of safe and responsible migration is not a domestic one, it's not a national one, but it involves regional cooperation. So it necessitates that all stakeholders come together. This means governments, this means the private sector, employment brokers, and other international agencies. That being said, our research specifically looked at the role that governments have traditionally played and can play, as well as the private sector. For governments, as Mr. William pointed out, that regional, bilateral, as well as multilateral agreements have contributed, but there's still a long way to go. But we acknowledge the role that the supportive role that governments have played in facilitating labor movements through these agreements, and legislation is important. That said, apart from legislation, governments like that of Nepal and Philippines have undertaken some more actions, like setting up migration offices in destination countries, which promotes migration issues domestically as well as regionally. The other issue is that of recruitment governance. So there is a need to improve recruitment governance. This mainly relies on increasing transparency and increasing awareness of migration issues. So migrants are aware, and there is better recruitment governance overall. What can the governments do for this? The governments should also should license and monitor recruitment agencies. The other issue is that of high recruitment fees. Countries such as Thailand have introduced zero recruitment fee system. Countries like Cambodia are already encouraging their recruitment agencies to move towards a reduction in recruitment fee and move towards a zero fee model. So that is an important step that the governments could take. And finally, about businesses and the role that private sector can play. From a research perspective, we do not have enough data to confirm that the role that businesses have played in bettering migration issues or improving outcomes for migrants. But we've relied on a few case studies which helped us in understanding that MNCs have become more aware of labor laws, and they are now more observant of local labor governance, both directly and in their supply chain. So that's a welcome move, and we expect to see more of such awareness in the private sector. One of the case studies that I'd like to highlight here is that of Unilever UNICEF initiative, which basically combats stigma against migrant workers returning home during this pandemic, which lends this humane attitude towards migrants, which we need to see more of. So to sum up, I would just like to say that it calls upon for regional cooperation, and that is what has been indicated time and again in our research. Thank you. Over to you, Mia.
Thank you, Minakshi. And let's now turn to William. Based on your direct experience with migrant workers, I'm sure you have many advice, but maybe top 2 practical advice that you want to give to governments and businesses. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Mia. And well, 3 points related. One is we have global mobility of labor, but we don't have global governance of labor. And I think it's time that we started looking at models that are out there, like the International Maritime Organization, for example, which looks at seafarers and standards within seafarers kind of thing. And around that kind of a design, we can look at even WTO and India, for example, when the HB1 visas in the US during the Trump regime, when the cost of it was increased, India took the US to the WTO to settle the issue. So India actually filed a case in the WTO because of this increase in the cost. This is something we definitely have to look at, somewhere of a global governance that has a justice mechanism within that. And I think technology has allowed that. We have seen today, and for example, UAE and some other countries have now introduced e-trials and e-courts. Why can't we introduce that for migrant workers? Why can't we have transnational justice mechanisms for migrant workers? I think this will be one way of addressing this whole abuse and exploitation of migrant workers. The challenge with migrant workers is the power that they have against businesses, against employers, against the state is very limited, very limited. Also complicated because of the drivers that compel them to move. So if we can have transnational justice mechanisms designed along a global governance mechanism, and this could be within the ILO or within the IOM, or as a combination of both, a department set up by both of them, this would be a fantastic move to change the power imbalance between migrant workers. I think if we can look at that, that would be fantastic.
And thank you for the transnational justice for migrant workers. I know you have the Justice for Wage Theft campaign going on, and I encourage everyone who's listening in to find more about this campaign. It's quite impressive, and we need to have more agencies and people involved. So last but not least, ILO, NILIM. You know, ILO has been leading on discussion of future work, and so what's your expert opinion on this? Over to you.
Thank you, Mia. As we don't have very much time, I'll be very brief. There are three broad areas. First is admission policies and recruitment. Second, the protection of all migrant workers. And third, skills. I think in the time available, let me just speak mainly about protection of migrant workers, taking into account the lessons of the pandemic. In terms of future work, we need to protect all migrant workers, that is, including all workers who will be engaged in digital platforms. So it's important to look at the digital labor platforms, the measurement of work there, and the protection of workers within those platforms. Now, if we look at the pandemic, what the bedrock of ILO standards, labor standards, is that nationals and migrants should be treated the same in employment and working conditions. Now, where were they not treated the same during the pandemic? And it was quite critical. It was social protection, access to unemployment insurance, access to income support, wages. There was no equal treatment. And it is very important to have equal treatment of migrants and nationals in employment and working conditions, including social protection. Next, what did we see where a big gap came out, especially in our region, in Singapore, in Thailand, in Malaysia, was workers' housing and accommodation. We need to put attention to, first of all, setting proper standards in terms of housing and accommodation, and then implementing and enforcing that. Lastly, as William mentioned, recognize domestic work as work and include domestic work in the labor protections. During the pandemic, domestic workers in countries where they live in the house of the employers, when they lost their jobs, they were literally on the streets. And we have to give attention to domestic work and give them the same protections as other workers. In terms of the care economy, there's a need to invest in the care economy, in training. It's not just that the care work will be done by migrant workers. There has to be an investment in systems. And lastly, let me say something about admission policies and recruitment, because it pertains quite a lot to employers. I mean, employers drive labor migration in the sense that they are recruiting and employing migrant workers. And they usually like to employ workers easily in a facilitated way. And so it should be facilitated where there is a labor shortage, skills shortage. But governments also have a responsibility to protect jobs for their nationals. So they have to make a judgment. And there are various options to respond to employer requests for employer requests for migrant workers, and that this area of admission policy is also can be quite complex. It's related to good labor market information, taking into account productivity and impact of productivity. So this is an area that will require attention as well. Thank you.
Not only those general points, but very specific points on the recruitment, admission, and social policy, and especially the care work. And in the future, that sector is probably going to be more prominent. So thank you for pointing it out. And equal treatment, I think that's at the core of all the challenges or discriminations and or the discussions that we had today. So I think for us, but I do want to say one thing is that, we talk about different needing the global governance and all that. But I'd like to remind ourselves that in 2018, the governments around the world adopted this UN's Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration. And with its 23 objective, it does provide us with a comprehensive framework that cover those, if not all, the areas that we discussed today. So we already have this general framework and direction to work with, and thus it's a matter of commitment from the government, but also all the actors involved to the GCM principles and meaningful implementation of GCM in their countries. And of course, the importance of more efforts and closer international collaboration from the states and private sector would be essential. So we only have 5 minutes. I don't think I've done a very good job as a moderator with timekeeping, but I've read through some of the questions and I think many of them were already answered in the discussion. But there's one that I would ask William, and one question would go to William, is about what's happening in some of the destination countries with the COVID-19, with xenophobia and discrimination and racism, and it's mostly to Asian. So with all these attitudes changing in some of these host countries, do you see public perception toward migrant workers influencing migration trends? If so, how and what can be done? Maybe 3 minutes?
I look at the countries of destination largely for Asian migrant workers in the Gulf. And while we have seen this, I will say this, that I think part of the reason is what NILIM has said, is that the prior kind of situation of migrant workers, accommodations, cluster accommodations, poor accommodations, and things like that, together with the insecurities that of people losing jobs and the economy slowing down and all, naturally the populations went to, as usual, the scapegoat, that is the migrant worker. I think governments or countries of destination need to do a better job. They need to do a better job in trying to show that migration has been part of their design for development. Migration has been part of their design for growth as well. So while we'll see, while it is something that has grown in this time of the pandemic, and there is, if it is not in some way, we don't go to the facts, if we don't start deconstructing this discourse, if we don't move into trying to unmask this discourse, I think we will find ourselves in a place where this becomes this will do more harm than good to the migration discourse. And I think the sooner countries of destination make an attempt, which is not yet there, countries of destination make an attempt to bring out how migrants have contributed and in many cases held up their societies in the time of the pandemic. I think that message is not being told often enough, and I think this is something we will have to deal with, especially because we had already seen a global segmentation of labor, and now you're going to see this even more with economies trying to recover. And like for example, in the Gulf countries, they're talking of localization of jobs. Bahrain has said those who have not returned, locals can take their jobs and things like that. There's a lot of this happening, but there's not much of how to unmask this, how to deconstruct this. There's not enough of that happening among states and among among businesses and the private sector.
Thank you, William. The role of destination countries is so important, but we mostly, when we talk about labor migration, especially, we talk a lot about the sending countries, but destination countries have a lot of responsibility, and they benefit greatly from the migrant workers. So they not only responsibility, they're accountable to conduct, to make sure that the migrant workers in their countries can have a positive outlook. I think we have only 1 minute, but I do want to ask this one more question on the future of migration in terms of gender, because I don't think we had a gender aspect. So maybe if I could ask NILIM to give like 1 minute on how the gender aspect would play in the future of migration, labor migration, that would be great.
Thank you, Mia. So if we are talking about skills, and we know that in the future of work, that there needs to be reskilling, upskilling. People will have probably more than one job in their life. So keeping this in mind, we must have opportunities for training and skills development for women, which is outside the traditional occupations. So there must be access to women in the labor migration process to the better paid jobs, the skilled jobs, and they should be given the opportunity to avail of that. Keeping at the same time, we have to keep in mind that work that women currently do in domestic work and other sectors is often not well protected, and those occupations, those sectors will be should be come under the protection of the labor law. And as researchers, as policymakers, or as NGO workers, we have to keep in mind that labor migration is not the same for men and women. There is a differentiated impact, and this is always important to keep in mind.
Yes, thank you, Nilan. Yes, there's a gender aspect, and for current migration as well as future migration, women are more vulnerable in many of the sectors, but also it's important that women have the equal opportunity as men for better wage jobs and better protected jobs. So unfortunately, it's time to close. We apologize because there's some technical difficulties, and we've not been able to provide too many answers to your questions. But I hope that you still found our discussion today useful and interesting. I certainly found it thought-provoking and personally learned a lot. So I really want to thank all the panelists. It's been a privilege to moderate this session, and I hope everyone who tuned in found it interesting and useful. And I want to thank the organizer and also our excellent IOM Crest team for all their support and coordination. So thank you very much, and everyone, please be safe wherever you are, and please be vaccinated, get vaccination if there's an opportunity. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks all. Thanks all. Bye.